Let me go ahead and start with introductions today. I want to thank you for joining the 4-H Military Partnership today for the webinar. I know we're having a few technical issues today, but hopefully people will be able to connect with us shortly. I'm Carol Fink, the 4-H Project Coordinator for the 4-H Military Partnership. The partnership represents a collaboration of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, 4-H National Headquarters, and the Army Child, Youth, and School Services, Navy Child and Youth Programs, and Air Force Child and Youth Programs. Extension was created to take the latest research to local communities and help them apply the research within their communities. Today we are fortunate to have Dr. J. Mancini, Professor of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Georgia, and Dr. Catherine Walker O'Neill, who holds the position of Postdoctoral Research Fellow within the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Georgia since completing her PhD in 2011. Both of these distinguished researchers have guided and continue to lead the research and application of family research. To provide more time for them to present their work within 60 minutes, I posted their bio on the 4-H military website along with other supporting materials. Please forgive me for recognizing them for this short fraction of time. The link is within the question and answer area that you can click on after this session or during this session. Dr. Mancini's work has focused on lifespan human development, community systems, building community capacity, military family support systems, time use of families, and psychological well-being. Throughout his career, he has focused on resiliency and vulnerability of individuals, families, and communities and their multiple intersections. He has published in many periodicals in youth development area, family relations, and also authored several books and currently working on a book in the area of family stress management, a contextual approach. Dr. Mancini's current theory and research focuses on family and communities in the context of this study we'll discuss today. Active research projects include examining the social relationships of youth and their implications of developmental outcome studies of parents and their adolescents regarding family dynamics, youth development outcomes, and international study of intersection of resiliency and vulnerability of homeless veterans. We are also fortunate today to have Katie Walker O'Neill, who focuses on social determination of health and well-being during their life stages and contexts, typically defined as high levels of transition and change, as examples in adolescence, later adulthood, and military families. Within the Family and Community Resiliency Lab, she also manages the data collection of 2 extensive surveys, military youth and their families, almost representing 2,000 in total, and oversees the statistical analysis and publication stemming from this data. And for myself, I always am thankful for those that love statistical data and is willing to work and guide that work. We talked earlier about presenting this webinar last spring, but these researchers wanted to dig deeper into their data to help us understand and develop programs that make a difference. Thank you, Dr. Mancini and O'Neill, for your continued interest in youth and families and communities in which they live. Dr. Mancini has been a great supporter of Extension and our 4-H military partnership work. We have multiple Extension staff that have been Dr. Mancini's student or a major. He has provided support through being their major professor. Thank you, Dr. O'Neill and Mancini, for sharing your work today and helping us improve our knowledge and skills to work with youth and their families. If you have questions about the research or application of the work today, please type those questions in the chat box. We will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you, Dr. Mancini and Dr. O'Neill, for joining us, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Carol. We are pleased to be here and to talk a little bit about some of the findings that come from the various researches that we've been doing over the past several years. It's really great to see the list of participants because I know quite a number of you. And we have either worked together along the way, or I have worked with you in graduate school, or have worked with you on various military projects. So I'm pleased to recognize quite a number of names. A lot of the work we do in the lab at the University of Georgia really does look at the many ways that vulnerability and resilience presents itself. And in the case today, we're really focusing on youth in military families. One of our approaches sort of to our work in the lab is this, that you really cannot understand resilience unless you also look concurrently at vulnerability. And the reverse is true. It's hard to really get a clear picture of vulnerability without also looking at resilience in the lives of individuals, families, and communities. So a great deal of the work that we talk about really reflects that kind of dual presence of resilience and vulnerability. I know that quite a number of you on the line today are really centered on prevention and intervention as it pertains to the lives of youth in military families. And a lot of the data we're going to talk about today really is program centered. And we will continue to kind of mine those data as the years unfold. I want to give some credit to how we got to the point of actually doing this research. I will also show you our pictures. One of us looks just great, and then there's the other person as well. So the data that we're going to draw upon today were collected in 2012 and 2013. And the project was funded by Headquarters Army Child, Youth, and School Services. I want to give particular thanks to M.A. Lucas, the former headquarters chief, for sponsoring the study. Our project is one of the last projects that M.A. Lucas, in fact, funded and sponsored before she retired, and we are very grateful for that. We are also grateful to Nancy Campbell, who at that time was also with the Army, and until I guess maybe a year or two ago retired, but I think is back in the mix of things, back in San Antonio. But we thank Nancy Campbell very much for kind of walking along with us to iron out the many logistics of collecting data at numerous Army installations. I also want to mention, and I think some of this is posted on the e-extension web, that we have a number of papers that are available to you if you have an ongoing interest in some of this work. And I hope that after today, you will also feel free to email us if you have additional questions or have ongoing interest in our work. Some of the papers that I think are available to you have been published in Child and Family Social Work and in Military Medicine. And then in February, there's a paper coming out in Family Relations, one of the NCFR journals that, again, looks at military families and issues of resilience and vulnerability. So again, I see the talk today as also including an invitation for you to engage with us as time goes on. We are planning to attend, I believe it's a spring meeting of the 4-H military partnerships to talk further about these data. The talk will not be about the data you hear today. It will be some further analysis that we are doing. So I've talked briefly about sort of the introduction to resilience and vulnerability. And I've talked a little bit about the current study, and as we get into the talk, there'll be more details on there. But very generally, these are the half dozen questions that we hope to speak to today. What's the nature of program involvement? What do actually programs provide for youth? The assumption that we all make is that youth development programs have meaning, and we make the assumption that youth development programs are targeted to make particular kinds of differences in the lives of adolescents and their families as well. We also know that wherever we go, some number of youth are not involved in formal programs, and so we'll speak a little bit to that as well from from our data. And then we will talk briefly about one of our analyses that actually contrasted program participation with various indicators of how well youth are doing. And then we're kind of going to wrap up with again a particular analysis on kind of risk factors. One of the other assumptions we make about programs generally for youth, and certainly for kids in military families, is that there's something protective about youth development programs that in fact become sort of mitigate some of the other risk factors that may be in the lives of youth. And we'll speak to that as well from the data that we have. For those of you that read in this area of resilience, you know that there's been, I would say, an explosion of the use of the word. I'll give you an example. It's quite interesting that if in the 1950s you asked the question, what kind of books that are published use the word resilience, you would find that most of them are from the fields of textiles and the field of engineering. Now, if you fast forward to today's world and you ask the same question, what's the preponderance of books that are published that use the word resilience in their title? You will find that the vast majority of those books are in the social and behavioral sciences. It's no wonder that in the year 2000, our colleagues from University of Missouri, Larry Gannon and Marilyn Coleman, spoke about this as the age of resilience when it comes to the field of the discipline of family science, as well as the more general fields of social and behavioral science. When we speak of resilience, there are several important elements. One has to do with the challenges that people face. And in our work, we can demonstrate that the challenges that military kids and their families face are diverse, and some of them are very powerful challenges, relatively more difficult to manage, and others are more reasonable to manage in fact. So the notion is that to understand resilience, we have to also account for what's the challenge in people's lives. Ideally, we can account for how well were individuals and families doing prior to a particular challenge facing families. And then as individuals and families negotiate and navigate these challenges, what in fact occurs along the way, that is the process of dealing with issues. And sort of at the end of the tunnel, what is the status of individuals and families? And the notion of resilience is that individuals and families are often better off also. A lot of us spend a fair amount of time trying to sort of be smart about ways of thinking of human development and contexts. And we put up there for you our colleague Rich Lerner's complex the lives of youth are. And you can take about this for a very important reason. And that is that as interventionists or preventionists, that if we get too focused in a singular way on an aspect of an adolescent's life, we often in fact are concurrently focusing on vulnerability and resilience. So we can see from Rich's model very briefly the multiple contexts that influence the lives of youth and the various networks that really are important for not just navigating everyday life in a sort of normative way, but are also significant for the extraordinary events that occur in an individual's life or in the life of families. So, to me, what Lerner's model says to us is this is where youth live, and please recognize the complexity of that. I think you've had Rich actually do a seminar for you recently, and he probably spoke to his own model. So if you look at the photograph here under resilience, it's interesting. Try to keep weeds at bay in our homes. We know that nothing will stop certain kinds of plant growth. And here's an example, really, a pictorial view of resilience. In the face of adversity, growth, flowering, and development. Now, I will add a footnote to this. There's a very important book recently published by Michael Unger. Unger is a Canadian researcher and psychologist who focuses on resilience and youth in particular, and families. Then, as social activists, we must be focused on the multiple successfully overcoming adversity. It involves something about the capacity to adapt. And not only and it was at the just after the 1-year anniversary of the bombing at stories unfolded. It's interesting how people were able to say that in the face attaching new meaning to the lives that they were leading. On the vulnerability side, it's what we, I think, are all very familiar with. Developing in ways that are not so ideal. We also know that vulnerability can be very much external to a family, but it can also be internal to a family. We also know the vulnerabilities they face, we must pay attention to such issues as the locus of vulnerability and whether it's chronic or acute. So we're going to talk mainly about a 2012 survey that was conducted at a number of active duty Army of information that were included in this online survey. Quite a bit of this, of course, we won't be touching on today, but it gives you a sense of some of the other ways we're looking at these data. And as time goes on, if you have questions of us after today, you may want to know more about, for example, our studies on emotional well-being, our studies that look at the efficacy, self-efficacy of adolescents, and also some of the other data we have on their social life and sort of how they navigate those relationships. I'd like to show you several screenshots located in Charlotte, North Carolina. But this gives you just one of the screenshots, a couple of the screenshots that youth saw as they took the survey. Most youth completed the survey somewhere in the 25 to 45-minute range. Again, in looking at youth as young as 11 and as old as 18, there's a lot of variability in sort of how they would approach and with adolescents. And this just gives you the items from the self-efficacy scale. And I suspect, given the work that a lot of you do, you've probably seen these sorts of items many times before. As you know, it's always a challenge to keep any of us on task, whether we are 13 years old or people our age. And so in the midst of this online survey, we had a variety of breaks where kids would build a puzzle. And they could build it in any number of ways. And it also kind of works in the interest of minimizing fatigue. What surprised us, I was convinced that the older a child got, the less interest they would have in fooling with this. But our observations in the computer labs where kids took this is that regardless of age, adolescents enjoyed this. Didn't matter if they were 11-year-old or an 18-year-old. They had a great deal of fun with this. And as you know, data collection can be undermined in a lot of ways. So we're happy that we found a way to sort of negate some of the fatigue that naturally occurs when kids are doing this kind of study. I'll talk for a few moments about a description of the sample. And again, these were all active installations. And you can see that more than half of the sample lived on post. That is largely due to 3 of the sites were located in Germany. And as we know that, I think the average for families or individuals living on post is a lot less, obviously, than half. And then we kind of broke down the issue of, if you don't live on post, then how far do you live away? Important information analysis because of the preponderance of youth development programming that occurs literally on the installation itself, which is not to say that all does, but the preponderance, in fact, occurs on the installation. Whoops, let me go back. So you can see the breakdown for age and sex. That again, it was a youngish sample, in that the arithmetic average 13 plus. Well, hold on. All right, there we go. Again, just a little breakdown on sort of the family environment in which adolescents, these 1,000 adolescents, okay, I don't know where that came from. If you look at siblings, and we see that in quite a number of cases, respondents were in a multi-child family. I will mention that we do have an analysis coming out in 2015 that looks at the role that family structure plays in adolescent well-being, and that'll be coming out later in 2015 in Journal of Family Issues. Well, for those of us who have or have had adolescents, one of the big questions is, where are our kids now? And so as part of the backdrop to some of our analyses, we asked the question, where do kids go after school? And so we asked them, on the average week, how many of these school days are you at home without a parent present? Go to a teen or youth center on post, or take part in some kind of formalized activity outside of school. And you can just see a brief breakdown of that. So we have almost half reported going home without an adult present at least once a week, and quite some number almost every day each week. Again, another analysis that we have in the works really focuses on the matter of where do kids go after school, and are they involved in youth development programs, either sponsored by the Army or outside the installation, or are they pretty much home alone? And we'll be looking at that within the context of other qualities of family life, as well as outcomes such as youth efficacy and performance in school.
So I would just highlight really quickly the center pie chart shows that over half of the kids suggest or saying that they don't go to the youth or teen center on the post any days in a given week. And at the bottom you see we've highlighted that over 40% of the adolescents said that there's just simply not enough to do in their community. So from their perspective, that suggests that either they're not aware of what's going on, or those are not the types of activities that they are really looking for.
Okay, it's interesting, and we may have a slide later that actually amplifies what Katie has talked about. I think a couple slides later, when the question is asked, why don't you participate in certain arenas? I think one of the more common responses is not being informed. So we will in fact return to that. I will say anecdotally, when we collected these data, we spent a lot of time in the on-installation youth centers, because the data were collected in the computer labs. And I think a lot of people on the call have probably seen those computer labs on various installations. So, and we had these labs open for data collection quite a number of hours each day. And so we actually got to be in the mix, if you will, of the comings and goings of youth in the youth center. One of the questions I think we may reflect on in a few minutes is, well, who doesn't participate? And oddly enough, and maybe you have a better explanation than I, boys tend not to participate less, and kids who live on the installation tend to participate less, and that's sort of an anomaly to me. But nevertheless, we can return to that later. So looking at this slide, it's almost 700 of the kids in our sample of 1,000 attended an activity or activities in one or more of the CYSS program service areas, and we will break that down in a moment. But for the most part, through Army Child and Youth Services, there are 4 service areas or program areas, and I think a lot of you are familiar with those. So we see that one is called Arts, Leisure, Recreation, another Life Skills and Citizenship, another Sports, Fitness, and then Academic Support. A lot of the programming, which I do know that you know, is derived from either 4-H Youth Development Programming or from Boys and Girls Club of America programming. So that gives sort of the generic breakdown.
Overall, that slide excuse me, also shows that what we see most often is that the largest majority were participating in sports, fitness, and health programs, whereas academic support programs were the least common areas that youth reported participating in.
Okay. I think you're also aware that that when we talk about program, we're using the term sort of broadly. in that if you look at, and you can see some examples at the top of this slide, such as 4-H clubs or Skies Unlimited, photo contest, that we use the word program pretty broadly, and that it can include programs, if you will, that meet once a week for multiple times, and others, in fact, may be seasonal, so there's a lot of variability in that. So, but one of the things we're interested in is, well, okay, if you participated in one of the dimensions of art, leisure, and recreation, what did you get out of it? And so, again, just looking briefly at the breakdown, we divided sort of the range of responses, the physical, academic, social, and emotional. And the answers, to some degree, paralleled with kind of the areas such as art, leisure, and recreation. And that just gives you a sense of what kids say about what they got from this kind of programming. If you look at life skills and citizenship, again, the breakdown along the same lines. We use the same general categories of physical, academic, social, emotional, etc. We ask some very general questions such as, did you learn a lot? Or we kind of ask more specific questions about whether it helped with grades in schools, whether it really got in theory of leadership. So you have about 30% of kids really reflecting that one of the benefits was experience being a leader, which you would expect from the area of life skills and citizenship. Categories of sport, fitness, and health. It's a good thing that almost 90% said they got to exercise. You would, if that were low, you'd wonder what was going on in sports, fitness, and health. But again, you can just see the kids' take on that. For the most part, the kids in the sample were not saying, I didn't learn anything, it was not helpful. For the most part, they were able to identify some of the benefits that they received from that. And then the final area of academic support. And again, you'll notice at the center, at the top, it includes a homework center, as well as more generic programs, a lot of them from Boys and Girls Club. But again, please pay attention to the kind of diversity of response and sort of the range of benefits that kids themselves speak to.
I think one notable thing is just across the support or the program areas, youth pretty consistently said that one of the greatest benefits was spending time with other military kids. Approximately a third or so of youth said that was one of the key benefits for each of the 4 program areas. So clearly that looks like something that's important to them. A way of feeling connected to other military youth.
For some of you who know of our other work, you know that that's a major point of focus for us. That is the social life of individuals and families. So let me turn then to the issue of what about kids who are not involved. And so in the sample we had some number of youth that were just non-participants. And if you ask them why not, well, there's the, I didn't find it interesting. And then the other sort of common response was, I did not know these programs were available to me. We have a very large other category at the bottom. And because it was a highly structured survey, you could choose other, but we did not mandate that, in fact, the other category was explained. Now, the other piece is that kids may be involved in programs; they just may not be in Army CYS services. And so, what you see is kind of an overview of those kids who were involved in programs in the auspices of other organizations. The next slide just sort of gives a breakdown of some of the finer points of that. I want to lead you to the bottom screen, in that about 10% of the 1,000 kids were just non-participants in formal programs targeted at youth in the previous years. And again, as I said earlier in the talk, that tended to be more likely to be boys, and those who lived on post were nevertheless still non-participants.
I think that number is especially meaningful because our list of what was considered a program, like you already mentioned, was fairly broad. We were not did not create a very detailed, rigorous standard for what counted as a program. And so the fact that 10% of these youth were not involved with any of those types of programs or activities is fairly meaningful.
Let me shift to the question of, well, okay, what is it about programs that that are helpful? And let me ask Katie to sort of summarize some of these slides for us on how does program participation relate to important positive youth outcomes.
Okay. So essentially what we did was look at the youth who participated and compared those to the youth who did not participate in several outcomes that are of interest, including academic functioning, so essentially their grades, their school enjoyment, their coping ability, self-efficacy, and social provisions, which is really a measure of sort of what are the benefits of relationships with others? Do they gain a sense of attachment, a sense of integration, a sense of reliance on others? And what we found was, excuse me, that program participants typically had better grades and enjoyed school more than non-program participants. They had higher levels of coping in several key areas, including communicating with their family when problems arose, engaging in activities. They also had higher levels of self-efficacy, including their initiative and having a sense of persistence when faced with a challenging situation. And like I said, in explaining social provisions, what they get from connections with others, program participants reported having more of these relationship provisions. So in this, actually, the next slide shows you a breakdown of when we talk about social provisions, these are the actual items that we are using to measure those provisions. So, for example, I don't think other people respect my skills and abilities. I have relationships where my abilities and skills are recognized. Feeling a part of a group where people share similar attitudes and beliefs. So earlier Jay mentioned some of our research has looked at kind of program participation and how it relates to key indicators of youth well-being. And so one model that we have looked at recently proposes that the social provisions essentially are the gateway or the mechanism connecting program participation to youth well-being. And our model suggests that is an appropriate theory. It seems to hold true that program participants have higher levels of these social provisions, and in turn, social provisions were fairly strongly linked to having less depressive symptoms, less anxiety, and a greater sense of self-efficacy.
The next area that we look at that we want to, and this is probably the last analysis that we'll talk about today, and that I'll ask Katie to look at, is the whole issue of transitions. If we think about, how do we describe life in a military family or life in the military, a good way to talk about it is transition and change, dealing with challenges, some that are highly predictable and others that are less so. So I'll ask Katie to just kind of walk through some of our findings again on transitions related to life in the military.
This slide shows more of our descriptive results regarding the transitions that the youth in our sample have been exposed to. So approximately 18% of the youth had a parent who was currently deployed, and another 20% of those 20% were gone between 10 and 12 months over the course of the last year. And so it also shows over half of our sample had 2 or more changes in schools over the past 5 years. So These families have experienced a number of transition periods that are often associated with ambiguous loss, changes in mental health, and just typical conflict within relationships. Um, so when we looked at school outcomes or child outcomes, we found that youth of the parent who was deployed generally experienced similar levels of well-being than those without a parent deployed. So in other words, whereas we tend to talk about parental deployment as something that is very negatively related to youth outcomes, our analyses really show that deployment really is not, whether or not a parent is deployed was not predictive of youth well-being for our sample overall. Now, I mean, there are a few instances where you see differences, but across a broad variety of outcomes, you don't see very many differences. And a similar thing was found with school changes. So, number of school changes really was not does not appear to be all that traumatic for the youth in our sample. I mean, these youth, even youth who have experienced more school changes, still have relatively high levels of academic functioning, high levels of coping, self-efficacy, and social integration. So that's kind of more of a descriptive take on it. And then if we go ahead to the next slide, you'll see some of our other analyses looking at these transitions and other military-related context variables that are often considered as risk factors. So you'll see on the left-hand side of the page, the first 6 boxes show variables that are typically considered risk factors. So having a parent deployed, experiencing multiple moves, having an enlisted parent versus an officer parent, having multiple military parents, living outside the continental U.S., and living far from a base. And so research has, and theorizing has kind of anecdotally often suggested that these are associated with poor youth outcomes. And so we tested this model to say, are these 6 variables associated with poor functioning of youth in our data set? And then at the bottom on the left-hand side, you see we also looked at 3 what we consider more traditional risk factors in the sense that they aren't specific to a military population. These are variables that research has suggested are risk factors for youth across their context, so military youth as well as the general population. And so what we find is you see the top 2 variables, parental deployment and multiple moves, weren't linked to any of our youth outcomes. So these 2 variables really had no bearing on the level of depressive symptoms, academic performance, or self-efficacy. You see a few other significant paths. So, having an enlisted parent was linked to poor academic performance compared to having an officer parent. But really what I think is interesting is that across those top 6 boxes, you don't see very many significant paths. Whereas for the bottom 3, these kind of more normative or non-context specific risk factors, you are more likely to see effects on youth outcomes. So again, I think it's just a matter of what the research has often spoken to, meaning the negative and risky context of military families does not always play out in the actual research findings.
I think that's pivotal because, very often our research designs, and even our own, we really don't have research designs that sort of account for what's the normative things that youth experience, and how do we differentiate those normative things that are characteristic of most youth, whether it's an experience or whether it's the demographics of being a minority. How do we differentiate that from the more unique and particular influences that are associated with military life? I will point out, as an aside to that, is that a few years ago in the Journal of Family Psychology is a very good paper from our colleagues at University of Arizona, a meta-analysis that in fact speak in a more definitive way to the issue of what in fact are the risks for youth in the face of transition.
Yeah, that meta-analysis specifically showed that there were only small associations between deployment and developmental outcomes, and these were particularly small for adolescents. So we're not the first to suggest that these risk factors really don't have huge negative effects.
Okay, generally, the summary slide which I put up there kind of captures what Katie has already talked about. So we want to conclude our analysis with kind of a particular look at the notion of protective factors for military youth, because a lot of the programming that we desire to do are about sort of enhancing protective factors and at the same time mitigating risk factors.
Okay, so whereas the last model focused really on the risk, kind of a more vulnerability approach, we really want to end with a more of a resilience lens because that really is our frame of thought in our research. And so this model looks at the cumulative risk was essentially an index that used all of the 9 risk factors that I just spoke about on the previous slide. So looking at the cumulative number of those risks experienced, and that might be related to depressive symptoms or more depressive symptoms, poor academic performance, and lower self-efficacy. But we were really interested in kind of what are those pathways and what are those mechanisms? What's the family context, the community context that's responsible for that link? And so we looked at 3 specific contexts, one being family support, another being a measure of from the community context index, specifically looking at their affectional ties within the community, and then looking at their program engagement. And so essentially, if you just to walk you from left to right through the figure, what we see is that when you have more cumulative risk, they typically have less family support, fewer affectional ties, and are less likely to be engaged in programs within the community. And those are really important contexts, both at the family and community level, that have a lot of bearing on youth outcomes. But again, from a resilience point of view, what this really suggests is that these family and community contexts are key leverage points, key points of intervention that can be targeted to minimize the impact that the risk factors have on youth outcomes.
I think another way to amplify that is that we are all looking for what I would call leverage points. That is, where in fact are the spots for either prevention or intervention. And this slide alone really says, well, if you want to talk about leverage points, then look at what's happening within families, look at what's happening in the larger sense of social relationships, and then also pay attention to what programs are youth involved in. We've already summarized that, so let's go to the, whoops, hold on. Okay. Oh. Here we go. Okay. So just a way to sum up very quickly, and then we have time for questions, is that, part of the message in our studies is that all vulnerabilities are not created equal. And so if you remember the early analysis of looking at factors more clearly related to military family life compared with more generic factors that might be considered vulnerabilities, there's variation in fact, what they lead to. The other piece is that whereas risk can lead to poor outcomes, they can be altered by social relationships and ultimately what youth gain from programs such as self-efficacy. And I know that for a fact quite some number of youth development programs are about helping youth develop the skills where they can have more control in their own lives as they reach adulthood. And then the other summary point of importance is that formal programs do matter. They matter in and of themselves, and they matter with how they help youth develop important relationships, which then help them as they emerge into adulthood. So we will stop there and entertain questions for the final handful of minutes that we have. But again, I would encourage you not to forget about us. And we are certainly open to follow-up inquiries from you as time goes on. Are there any questions? Well, okay. Well, then Carol, can I thank people for being involved, or did you want to do that?
Um, yes, I'll be glad to thank people, but I do want to ask a question. As we work towards um, our programming in the future, do you have specific areas from this that you would like us or see that we could provide some of the most important self-efficacy, the internal characteristics, um, programs that you see that we can provide the best support in as we work with military youth and their families? Any specifics in that area from the research and programming that you saw happening?
All right. Another. Carol, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Um, so a couple of things come to mind. And I think these are already characteristic of a lot of the programs that are done for youth, in that programs that are highly experiential, which enable youth to act, if you will, on the environment, I think are the more productive ones. If you look at self-efficacy as an example, self-efficacy is about taking control, about feeling that we have some say about the course of our lives. And I think often that is best supported through experiences that youth have. And I know that in 4-H development programming, for sure, there's a key matchup. What my generic advice, though, is this, and it's not particular to a program. I think that we are not very good at specifying what are the desired results that we hope to see from a particular program that we have for youth, whether it's academically oriented, whether it's more sports oriented, or what have you. And a lot of the work we do, the consulting that we do, we help people who develop programs focus on what are the desired results, and then ask the question, how do you know that what you are actually doing in a program, the activity, in fact aligns well with those results? The other caution we give to folks as they're figuring this out is that be clear about the things that your program actually has some say about. You know, there are times when we desire very important things for children and youth, but our program has so little to say about that. That I think is a misspecification on our part. So I would suggest to program professionals, you know, what does your program really have? What's the goals or the results the program has some say about, and which are really beyond the reach of the program? Now, I also say that from the perspective of an evaluation researcher, and that sometimes we think programs fail, and oftentimes we think programs fail because, in fact, we have misspecified what a program actually has some say about to begin with. So that's more generic advice. The other advice I would give is this: if you read the work that we've done out of Georgia and in concert with our colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill, we talk a lot about the merits of programs for building and enhancing relationships. In a lot of the work that we do, and the work that a lot of other folks do in military environments, you find that social connections and social relationships potentially have an enormous positive effect on people's lives. And so, our advice has often been look at programs in terms of what do they do for establishing social relations and social networks. Now, here's my caveat, though. We also know that social networks can be also enormously bad for people. Let me give you an example. One of the best examples of community and social networks are street gangs. Not so productive for communities, but if you look at what street gangs do for members, they often have the same characteristics as we use in describing, pro-social relationships and strong communities. So I'm just going to throw that little piece in there because we have to caution ourselves not to blindly sort of consider stuff like networks, connections, and relationships.
Thank you for that information, and also want to thank you, as he has been working with 4-H, to help us identify some outcomes and indicators that we can use within the 4-H Common Measures. So he's been helping us within this effort all along as we work towards some evaluation components and identifying programs that really work to identifying impacts. And so we appreciate your effort in supporting us in that area also, Dr. Mancini. So thank you for joining us today. We invite you to come back, and if you want to review the webinar, we will post that on the 4-H Military website. And we can appreciate Dr. Mancini and Dr. O'Neill for their continued support of the military project, military youth, and our work to improve our programming. We do look forward to...
Well, we appreciate being part of this. The work that people on this webinar are doing makes a difference, and we're glad to see that. So thanks, one and all.